Go ahead.
You know, I kind of was curious. It's not as, I mean, it's all related, right? But I've heard a lot about the schools that people were sent to, and that's been a big topic of conversation. Can you share anything about that?
Yeah.
That would be
Yeah, I can.
of interest to me, yeah.
Well, here in Canada, we call it residential schools. I know I've heard it referred to in the United States as boarding schools. It's the same idea, but there's a residential school part in the Indian Act, I believe, where the children are sent away to a more central location so that they don't have to pay for schools all over the north or all over Canada. So they'd make a big school to send more children there, and I guess it was more cost effective for the government. They became, in effect, a type of prison for many children, and the parents it was actually legislated that they had to send them, otherwise the parents could be charged if their children didn't go to school. Some did manage to keep their children from going, and some did escape from being charged, but the majority had to send their children. And it was basically to teach them English and fit them, let them, to make them fit into Canadian society, so they become like citizens of Canada. And I think part of the whole thing was that they would stop being like Indian or First Nation or whatever you want to call them, and change them into supposedly a model citizen of Canada without a land or culture, but just to fit into the fabric of Canadian society. And of course that didn't work. What it did was cause a lot of anguish and grief amongst the communities and amongst the families, because their children were gone and they were not with the care of their parents, so they missed out on a lot of teachings that they would have got. And in these schools they were punished, physically punished, for speaking their native language. I myself did not go to a residential school because I was not considered Indian. My father, who was Métis, married my mother, who was from this reserve, First Nations. She was Cree from here. And under government policy, if a First Nations woman marries someone who is not a treaty or status Indian, that has a number in Ottawa, in the Department of Indian Affairs, they're considered no longer a member, no longer an Indian under the Indian Act. So so she lost her status that way. It doesn't change your skin color or your who you are. All it does is changes your legal definition of who is or is not an Indian. And it was only women that this was done to, whereas in First Nations treaty or status man married a non-native woman, Caucasian or other race, she instantly becomes part of that band where he's from and takes on, is being considered Indian under the Indian Act. So it actually is another way of destroying communities, because these women were no longer allowed to live on their home reserve. They had to move. And so that's what happened to my mother. Her husband, my dad, was just as native as any other native person around here, but because he did not have the designation as a treaty status Indian, then they lived elsewhere. He still made his living as a trapper. Back in those days, they were still doing a lot of trapping and making money. But she was no longer able to live there. He got sick. She couldn't keep us, look after us. We were taken away because of an episode where my father, who became violent through, had schizophrenic tendencies, and he became violent to the point where he took a gun and shot my mom. Didn't kill her, but she was sent to the hospital, and us children, there were 6 children, were all taken away. When my father became better, he was very, very remorseful about everything that happened, but really he lost his family. And us children were taken away and sent to an orphanage in Edmonton. Now, even though we weren't orphans, but it was hundreds of miles away, and my mother had no way of really keeping connected with us all the time, even though she would send letters and that. But what happened was we were put in this home. There were 6 children, 4 girls and 2 boys. So it was a girls' home. So we were put in the girls' home, and the boys were sent to another actual foster home. So that's how we were raised. We spent 3 years in the foster home before being taken and put in, not foster home, but I mean we called it convent. And it was run by nuns and priests and the Catholic Church. And then we were actually placed in foster homes, and we became wards of the Alberta government. So that the reason I know about residential schools is because that convent was run the very same way as all the residential schools were around in Canada. Most of them were church run. Just about all of them were, except for very few. But I'm sure it was very similar how they operated. So so I lived there for 3 years before I went to a foster home, which was a Catholic home. So we continued on that religious sort of instruction that we started with in the convent. And in the convent, we were punished if we spoke our native language. Like for myself, it was Cree. It's Cree. And whether it's Cree or Dene or some other language, we'd get strapped with big straps on our hands. We endured a lot of punishment. We had to do a lot of praying and because we had to go to church at least 3 times a day, and in those days you can get slapped across the face, and it was just part of teaching. That happened to me many times. And we would have to, if we wanted to speak in our language, we'd have to whisper to each other so that we didn't get punished. And so that's just one story. And all the residential schools were like that. You're not allowed to speak your language. So that was part of the assimilation process, so that take away the language, you're going to take away a lot of the very thing that makes you who you are. And the traditional teachings that normally people would get, they're not getting, because they might have a chance to go home in the summer or they might not. And then they're all like strangers when they go back to their communities. It's hard on the parents as well as the children. And children were lonely, and they were like, every night they'd be crying, and there was no love there. You didn't have the love of your family. And if you happened to have a member of your family that you were very close to that one in the same convent or residential school. And some places they wouldn't even let you hang out with your own brothers. They wouldn't allow that. And it was very sad when the children were crying for their older sister. They weren't allowed to touch. They weren't allowed to spend time together. So it was like a terrible experience. And not only did they have the loneliness and the lack of caring and love and closeness and traditional teachings, but some were subjected to some terrible abuse. It could be physical abuse, like in my case, it was mental, spiritual, sexual abuse, and that became quite common. So it was like a haven for pedophiles because they were allowed to get away with it if they kept it quiet. And so, and generations endured that kind of thing. And it's happened to some family members who still can't speak about it. So it's a source of great, you know, it was a huge time of life that was very hard. And so we've got people who are living the legacy of that, you know, in their daily lives. And a lot of people did turn to drugs and alcohol later in life when they got out of these places. They couldn't cope with, you know, some of the things that happened to them. And it's the last maybe 10 years that the focus has come on it, like looking at what really were they, what did they do. That's now very much evident, and the Prime Minister of Canada even issued a public apology in I think it was 2007 or 2008. Can't remember the year, but I guess he had to. I'm sure he. I don't know if he really knew much about it, but right. I'm sure. But as I guess he felt it was his job, he had to do it. He was probably told to, and I guess.
Sorry, I interrupted you.
Well, it's just like I know the survivors, people who went through, you know, like say the Japanese people who were who had their fishing boats and everything stripped from them, and they were treated, you know, they're put in concentration camps during the Second World War and that kind of thing. They think they got an apology and actually some funding back. The same thing for the Chinese people with the head tax here in Canada. They were given a $500 head tax just to come in to the country and be able to work here. That was in early 1900s. I mean, there's so many, you know, injustices that have been done throughout, you know, the years, and that's one of them. But it's a very big part of our Canadian history that was ignored for many years, and now it's out there in the public eye.
What changed? Is it accurate that they ended in the 1990s?
Yeah, I think the last one was probably sometime in the 1990s, but they weren't run quite the same as the ones that ended mostly in the 1970s. And I'd met some people who came out of the residential schools when I was just a teenager, and I was living in Vancouver, and I was young, like 18, 19, 20, that time period in my life, and I met many people who had come out of the residential schools. And this is when sort of the awakening of, you know, that was during the civil rights movement in the United States. It was women's liberation going on. It was like all these liberation movements around the world, and we were very much part of it. And
okay.
I became a very political person back in the 60s and 70s, and the people that I became involved with who were in residential schools told me their stories, and I saw just what a huge impact it had on our people. And because they were able to articulate, because they're, you know, they did speak English and were able to read and write, and they were a lot of really intelligent, angry young people coming out. And we connected, and these stories started coming out, and I learned a lot about what had happened to those people, you know, because it was very similar what happened to me, and even though some others just had much more horrific experiences. So now they're being documented. There's books, there's films, there's all kinds of things out there with information. There was an inquiry or some kind of a national, I guess, like an inquiry that really looked into what happened. And so there's really lots of documentation now, but people are still, we call them survivors. Residential schools, they're still doing that. They're still I mean, they're still out there. Some have gone through healing and some haven't. You know, some are still angry and kind of locked into that anger, and it's hard. It's hard for people.
Can you tell me about Truth and Reconciliation? It's something I've heard about in Canada.
Well, the Truth and Reconciliation is a Canadian government initiative to work with survivors of residential schools. And so this is where they've held hearings throughout Canada, all over all the different areas where there were residential schools, and in big centers in the cities they would have hearings, because so many people live in cities, or more Native people living in cities now than actual in their home reserves or their Métis communities. So they went to various places and had hearings where they would sit and they would have people come in and tell their stories. It would be all documented, and some legal firms have taken it on and gotten big settlements for their clients. There have been class action suits against the government, the churches, the various churches. The various churches have got involved to try to, I guess, rectify that bad image they had because of their part in what happened. So they've got together to try to be involved with, you know, the healing aspect or the reconciliation aspect of it. So, yeah, so many people have had that opportunity to tell their stories, and I think we're going to see more stories coming up for many years to come.
Yeah.
It's like slavery.
Yeah.
They're still writing books about the slavery experience. Still going to keep going because some new story is going to crop up somewhere, and it'll just keep going.
Yeah.
And it's good, and that's the truth part of it.
Right.
Is we need to know what happened.
Has it been helpful?
Well, it has been, because I knew how important it was when I was just a very young woman living in Vancouver and then Edmonton. Because I saw the results of some of these people that came out. The prisons are filled with people like that who have gone through that, or their parents or their grandparents, so that it's just gone down through generations that needed help, and if they didn't have it, they become by the wayside, or they become locked into some kind of abusive lifestyle.
Can we ask one more question on colonialization, since we're sort of in this topic? One of the two themes that emerged for us when we were envisioning this journey were colonialization and anti-colonialization, and as well Indigenous rights, and we were moved by some of what Ariel Deranger had said about that she isn't an environmental activist, she's a Indigenous rights activist when she's doing work on tar sands or on climate change and all the different work that she does. And so just kind of stuck with us in our as our conversation evolved. But since we've been on the journey, there have not been many discussions about either of those topics, anti-colonialization or Indigenous rights, other than some of what's come up today in our interview. And we've had other conversations too, but if there's anything more you'd like to add on any of that, that'd be great.
Yeah, well, I guess the language around it started developing in the 1960s, when this was after the Chinese Revolution. In those days, we didn't know any of the harmful effects of what Mao Zedong's policy was at the time, but we followed that. It was to us good that they overthrew the British oppressors, and like we applauded that, and the same way for some of the movements in Africa. We saw that they were doing something about it, like in India with Gandhi. They threw out their we call them oppressors, right? And then when the civil rights movement started really becoming a huge force in the United States in the early 60s. In the mid-60s, we saw that. And then we saw also that the generation that we call them the hippie generation, or that they're the peace and love, kind of people that started coming out in the 60s. They saw Native people, First Nations, or whatever, as being kind of iconic or romantic-looking figures with the long hair, beads, and feathers and stuff like that. And we responded to that, and it made us think that now they're starting to see us as somebody desirable to look like or be part of, or and so that all that had an impact. We saw, even when I was in high school and I knew about the black people's struggle in the United States, it was very interesting to me. And so I knew that other, like oppressed people, we call ourselves oppressed people, we saw all these different movements that gave us this energy, and sort of helped us along, because we wanted to do something too. So studying the leftist kind of movements out there that made us feel that we were we're heading towards our own revolution, our own awakening as people taking our rightful place in the world. That started happening, and we became very politically involved. We were studying, we looked at Frantz Fanon's books, all types of like the Black Panthers, what they were doing, and that they call that Black Power. We called ourselves Red Power, and we had our own kind of movements going, and then we started gathering and meeting and having demonstrations and protests and everything. That it was really, we got involved in that, and I was involved in that, and we went to we just educated ourselves, and then we started moving towards our own knowledge. Who are our elders? What have they got to teach us? We started working with them. We had elders gatherings where we would be able to speak with some of our traditional knowledge keepers and elders that could help guide us in on what we're trying to do. And basically we're trying to find out who we were and find ourselves, and we found that. We found our strength and our pride, and just went on, and it started growing. And then we started having children and families and so on, and then it just kept on going. And we had a lot of problems along the way because of our upbringing and what happened to us. So, and some of that passes on to our children, and it makes it hard on life. But we're on the right track. Back to a realization of who we are as people, as communities and nations.
Right. Awesome.
I started it.
Yeah, and then just whatever else you wanted to say about that, and then we could segue that into, is there a relationship between colonization and climate change?
Yeah.
But starting with what you still were thinking about.
In the 60s and 70s, we talked about the effects of colonization, because that's what we were coming from. We had gone through that. And I had a friend, his name was Howard Adams. He was a professor, and he was a Métis from Saskatchewan. He was actually teaching at Davis, California, University of California, as a professor of anthropology. And he wrote a book called Prison of Grass, and I read that book, and it was called The Politics of Colonization. And it was very good. It really just made some things very clear we'd also met George Manuel. He wrote a book too called The Fourth World, where you've got the first world, second world, third world, and then the fourth world. I think he referred to as our people, our Indigenous people in Canada. And so we did a lot of talking about it and a lot of discussions in our meetings, in our communities, in our gatherings as young people. And when you talk to elders, they don't use words like colonization, But now that I'm an elder, I use that word, right? Because it was taught to me and what it means and everything. And well, we're still, we still have the effects of colonization because we have very few people that speak their language now. That's an effect of colonization. And now they call it globalization, because globalization, like everybody drinks Coca-Cola or wear blue jeans or, like it's all around the world. And so I guess we're in the middle of all that. It's powerful forces, where everybody, does the same kind of thing around the world. Colonized people have, I guess, thrown off their yokes of suffering, colonization, the effects of it, and but it sometimes stays with you where some of our people are still afraid, not afraid so much as almost ashamed to speak their own languages because of everybody wants to be the same and nobody wants to be I guess the cultural part of people, like if you look at young people, most of them, they just want to look like all the other young people. And it's hard to teach pride in your culture, your language and culture, when they're resisting that because they don't want to be different. So to me, that's the effects of colonization. And now globalization is there because everybody's buying Coca-Cola and blue jeans, or whatever it may be, right? Hopefully not Coca-Cola, but pop, So, but we're seeing that turned around because when we say going back to cultural ways, traditional ways, you have to be really careful. You don't get stuck in, some outmoded traditional ritual that is just was served a purpose at one time, but it's no longer useful today. Like I do want to make that distinction, that can happen because we don't know. It's kind of like we're relearning our culture in many ways. But there are so many good things that we have that are still intact and still here, and we do have like our ceremonies and our languages and that kind of thing. So it's like we're relearning. I'm actually trying to learn my own language, Cree, which I wasn't able to speak as a child when I was taken away. And my mom had gone through that experience of being ashamed, so she didn't even speak to us in the language at home. But my father did. So we did have that at a very early age, but it got lost along the way, and we're trying to get it back.
Yeah, I can relate as a Japanese American. That same story exactly happened to us, both with the concentration camps, but also just the immigration and wanting to fit in, even if they weren't directly being oppressed. There was that kind of cultural imperative to
right.
fit in, and
so you weren't singled out and made fun of or treated differently.
And now I'm fourth generation, and I don't speak very many words, and I've kind of shame in both directions.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. But anyway, back to you.
Well, there's so many things that you can learn from other, nations and cultures too, because I know in Europe, everybody speaks English as well as their own language. I mean, why shouldn't we? Sure. I mean, I don't say English is bad. It's a language that we're using to communicate. That's okay. But we can also learn other languages too. If you look at my grandfather, my great-grandfather, he spoke 4 languages fluently. He spoke English, French, Dene, and Cree fluently. So many of our older, elders from, quite a ways back, they spoke lots of languages. And most of the people around here, they spoke Dene and Cree, because there's a lot of Dene, and there's, Cree is the main language here, but we're also very close to many Dene communities. And there's a lot of traveling that used to go on. On the West Coast, they had a common language called Chinook, and that was a trading language, because trading was a big part of the culture there. And I guess the economy was based on trading, and a lot of that was here too. And so people, they were able to speak these different languages, and why not? So, I mean, right now you've got some Korean in the schools and high schools, but it's just not the same. It's kind of like a token thing. Like, even when I learned French in high school, I know a little bit, but I'm not fluent, So, I mean, you can't teach fluency without living it, and that's what we need here. And that's what we call decolonization, is, putting away, like getting rid of those feelings of, not feeling good enough because you're, either your skin color or your history or so on. Like, we have to learn our own histories of people that, the survivors, whether they were survivors of residential schools, survivors of cultural genocide, and whatever. We have to bring it back, relearn whatever it is that we didn't get when we were growing up, or whatever, and pass it on. That's decolonization. Pass it on to our children, grandchildren.
That's great. How about climate change?
Well, climate change, we know that's happening. I have no doubt, and the elders know that too. The people that live by, being out in the bush, being out, on the lake and the rivers, they see the difference. They know it's happening, so they don't deny it. There are deniers out there, but people that actually are close to the land, live on the land, or connected that way, they know. They see it, and I know that there is climate change, because I hear it all the time. I see a strange bug. It's never been here before. Different. The glaciers retreating. We know that's happening. I saw it myself. I went down to see the glacier in Jasper. Our rivers are lower, and it's not just climate change, but also impact of industry. Water withdrawals, huge amounts of water. There's a lot we don't know. We just know it's happening, but we don't really know specifics about it. We would be good to know. We also see the drying up of the wetland areas. It's much drier than it should be. We see the loss of animal habitats. We see fish changing, dying because its water level's lower, the oxygen's lower. There's all kinds of things that people do see, and they recognize that it's happening. So we see it as something we do have to really take seriously and work towards, either more awareness from everybody, so that we know what to expect, or at least to be prepared for. we need to be prepared because we have to look after our food sources and after our water, because that's what we need to live on. And we shouldn't have to depend on oil and gas being brought from somewhere else to heat our homes, to, you know, dry our clothes in the dryer, you know, like, we shouldn't have to do that. So we need to be aware, informed, and be prepared.
In our communities in the Coast Salish region of Washington, there's a lot of talk about empowering or allowing Indigenous peoples to lead, and
Well,
I think, I don't know if that's happening here or if that's something that resonates with you, but if it is, what suggestion does that make sense as a strategy to say, hey, environmental organizations step back, let the Indigenous people lead? You know, just curious if that's something you've heard about or
oh, we
resonates.
practice that here. Like our the organization I'm involved with, called it's an NGO called Keepers of the Athabasca Watershed Council. We're always involved. We've always been part of the board, or, you know, I've been a past co-chair. My cousin Roland Woodward has been a past co-chair. There's been a lot of involvement with the communities, First Nations communities, and the organization. And I also see it with groups like, you know, Greenpeace and Sierra and them. They usually hire at least one Native person, so that's something, you know. It'd be good to hire more, but, you know, but we need to strengthen our own groups and organizations, and we have a lot of communities that are really, you know, they're divided, and it's a process that, you know, has been happening for a long time and still there. It's called that's called colonization. You know, it divides people. You know, it's also the Indian Department of Indian Affairs. Now they call it the Aboriginal Affairs and Northern Development, AANDC, Northern Development of Canada, I think. Anyway, used to call it Department of Indian Affairs, DIA, now it's called that. They become more, I guess, politically correct by calling it Aboriginal, because I think they wanted to encompass the Métis as well, who are not status. They don't have a number that's in Ottawa, that says that they are a member of such and such band, you know, or they're a status or a treaty, you know, person. But okay, so what did you ask me again?
Oh, I was just asking about
Oh yeah,
Indigenous
leading the way.
leadership. Yeah,
Okay, now
and so part of it is
back to that.
What would you want to tell people?
Like, for instance, the Healing Walk. It was always the first people who were on the forefront were the elders of the First Nations elders, and then everybody else came. So that was symbolic, you know, in allowing, not allowing, but in making that work, that concept worked of First Nations people leading the way. I think we work together. That's how I see it. And when you're in a First Nations territory, you always acknowledge that territory. You know, like, I'd like to thank, you know, people of this land or this community or this, you know, we're on this territory, like you could say Salish territory, and right now you're in Cree territory and Dene territory, and we acknowledge that, and that's important, because it gives that, you know, that understanding. Yeah, this is where you are. This is whose land you're on, and yes, we do share it, but we've been here longer, and we have not just a physical connection, but a spiritual connection to the land. and our ancestors, our ancestors' bones are here, and that's something that's always with us. That knowledge that we have people, we have history, we have that spiritual, side that's
Right.
very much a part of our culture. So, and because we, I think all the First Nations I know of, they believe in respect for human beings, whether they're whatever color they are. They have respect, and ask for respect in return. So when you are showing that you respect the land and the people by, acknowledging where you are and going to them for when you're doing stuff on their land, you talk to them, right? And that shows respect. And so that just keeps going, that respect is returned. That's how it works.
Right. Yeah. What are what are impediments to moving forward from where we are now? From what's happening here? What's kind of holding you back? You personally, or the groups that you work with?
The impediments that we have to what?
I guess most broadly, I'm thinking about life and justice. Whether it's in regard to
I think we touched on environmental or climate change, and one thing I want to mention is environmental racism, where some places are like, because of the fact that there are no big cities with lots of white people there, you can put a toxic waste disposal plant right there, that kind of thing, which is happening in Alberta. And if you want to dump stuff, you dump it wherever you want to, as long as there's no nothing holding you back. I'm talking about corporations, dumping stuff into the rivers and or the lakes or the muskeg even, or burying it in underground. It just, you look at places like Bhopal, India, where that explosion killed thousands of people, and there was no justice there, really. And places in Nigeria, where they hung people because they were fighting against the oil company, and so I mean it's because there's so much there's so much focus here. They can't just run over the First Nations and get away with it. So they know that they have to be compliant with the laws and so on. So there's certain consultation that goes on, but it's still being done. The harmful effects are still happening. The air is still being polluted. The habitat for the animals is still being invaded and destroyed and so on. So environmental justice is definitely something very important, and I think that it's good to work. You have to work with the First Nations or local Indigenous people wherever you go and you're trying to do something. And so I think most of the big environmental organizations recognize that and follow it to some degree. But I think our group is doing pretty good, and Keepers of the Athabasca, and having that, we have Jessie Cardinal. She's she's an Indigenous young person that's doing a lot of the coordinating. She's a coordinator for Keepers of the Athabasca, and we have other people that are really involved, and it's very important to to have that connection and to work with it and you know, become good friends and allies.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, is there anything else you wanted to share with us? I think we should. Things to move
I
on.
spoke a lot.
Did you have a question, Phil?
A painfully broad question,
Mm.
but with regard to people back where we come from, what could people that live in our area possibly do to make things better around here?
Here.
Can you talk like you were talking to Derek though? Because of the eye line.
Yeah.
I'm sorry.
What could we do when you go back home to help things improve over here, or help it out somehow? I just think any outreach to do, because I'm not that great with social media, and with social media I'm not as I'm not on the internet all the time like some people are, but to get the word out about what's happening and just sharing, that's a good way, because I know that everybody, and probably you're involved with this, does a lot of that, and I think that's good in any kind of communication, you know, that gets out there. Help us if we need, you know, stay in touch with the people that are doing like Ariel, for instance, Jesse Cardinal with our group, with you know, myself even, because sometimes we need to get some information out that, you know, or maybe it's even a fundraising thing might be good to help us maybe get some of the things done that we want to do, like going on the land, because you need to get there. You need supplies.